Before we start the story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. When we first arrived at Shenandoah National Park, I remember thinking how peaceful it all was. The towering trees, the vast open skies, and the faint sound of birds singing in the distance. This was exactly the kind of break we all needed. I'm Alex, the planner of the group, and I'd organized this camping trip to get away from the stress of city life. Mark, my boyfriend, sat in the passenger seat beside me, relaxed and smiling as we made our way along the winding mountain road. Behind us in the RV were Jessica and Eric, my two closest friends. They weren't exactly the outdoorsy type, but they'd agreed to come along, maybe out of some sense of duty to reconnect. Eric was already cracking jokes about how bad he'd be at camping while Jessica half laughed, nervously fiddling with her phone. I remember feeling so confident, so prepared. I'd planned everything, except, of course, for the things no one could plan for. We parked the RV at a small, secluded site off the Appalachian Trail, far from the more populated areas. That was the whole point. Isolation, serenity, nature at its purest. The weather was supposed to be clear all weekend, perfect for hiking and camping. As we started setting up camp, the first signs of trouble were small. Jessica complained about her shoes. Ugh, these hiking boots are killing me. Why did I even buy them? They're probably just stiff, I said, brushing her off. I was already focused on getting the tent up, but that's when I noticed Mark shaking his head. The tent's missing poles, he said, laughing a little. We'll have to use the RV for tonight. Fine, I replied, hiding my frustration. Minor setbacks, nothing more. The real trouble began as dusk fell. It was subtle at first. As we sat around the small campfire Mark had built, the woods around us seemed to grow quieter. The birdsong, once a pleasant background, faded into nothing. No wind stirred the leaves, and even the occasional sound of wildlife disappeared. I chalked it up to the natural rhythms of the forest, nocturnal creatures and all that. But then I noticed the smell. At first, it was faint, a whiff of something rotten, like spoiled meat. I thought maybe it was something in the air, or that something had died nearby. I didn't mention it, not wanting to freak anyone out. Eric, of course, was oblivious to the shift in mood. He was still joking around, telling some story about a horror movie he'd seen last week. This place reminds me of one of those settings, he said, grinning as he poked at the fire. A group of friends in the middle of nowhere, and then bam, haunted by some spirit or creature. Shut up, Jessica muttered, hugging her knees. This place is creepy enough already. I rolled my eyes at them both, but Mark shifted uneasily beside me, glancing out into the darkening woods. I was about to ask him what was wrong when he stood up suddenly. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" I said, feeling a flicker of irritation. We'd barely been here a few hours, and they were already on edge. "I swear I heard something," he said, his voice tense, like footsteps, but heavy, coming from the woods. Eric laughed, but it was strained. "It's probably a bear or something, or maybe Bigfoot." Jessica looked pale, her eyes darting to the dark forest around us. "This isn't funny, guys." "It's nothing," I said firmly. "Just the woods settling down for the night. Let's not spook ourselves over nothing." But as the evening wore on, that smell of rot kept coming back, and so did the uneasy silence. Even the crackle of the fire felt muted. The next day was supposed to be better. We set out on the trail, hoping to shake off the weirdness of the night before. The weather was colder than expected, a thick mist hanging low in the valley, making everything damp. Jessica slipped a few times on the muddy path, cursing under her breath. "This fog is so creepy," she muttered. Mark tried to lighten the mood. "It'll clear up once the sun's out. Let's just enjoy the hike." But I could tell he was uneasy too. None of us had slept well. Every time I drifted off, I thought I heard something moving outside the RV. Maybe it was my imagination, but something kept waking me up, like a low rustling or breathing. Halfway through the hike, we reached a lookout point. The fog had lifted just enough for us to see the rolling hills stretch out below us. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. Then I saw Mark standing at the edge of the trees, staring into the distance. "Mark?" I called. He didn't answer. I walked over to him, a knot forming in my stomach. "What's wrong?" He pointed, his face pale. "Do you see that?" I squinted, looking where he was pointing. At first, I saw nothing but trees. But then, something moved. A figure, tall and gaunt, barely visible through the mist. It stood completely still, as though it had been there the entire time, watching. "It's just a hiker," I said, though my voice sounded less confident than I'd hoped. "That's no hiker," Mark whispered. "Look at it." The figure stood too tall, its limbs too thin, and its skin seemed pale, almost translucent. But before I could get a better look, it was gone, melted into the fog. By the time we got back to the RV, the mood had soured. Mark was withdrawn, barely speaking, and Jessica kept glancing over her shoulder, as though she expected something to jump out at us. The smell returned as we gathered around the campfire again that night. This time it was stronger, more pungent, like decaying meat left out in the sun. Eric wrinkled his nose. "Okay, seriously, what is that?" "It's the woods," I said, though even I didn't believe it anymore. The silence pressed down on us like a weight, and then, from deep in the trees, we heard it. A voice, soft, distant, but unmistakably human. "Help me." We all froze. "What the hell?" Eric whispered, his eyes wide. The voice came again, a little closer. "Help me." "It's someone in trouble," Mark said, standing up. "We need to go check." "No," I said, grabbing his arm. "We don't. That doesn't sound right." The voice was too calm, too controlled. There was no panic in it, no urgency, and it sounded wrong, like it was echoing in the wrong direction. Jessica was shaking now, her face pale. "We have to leave. I don't like this." For once, Eric wasn't joking. "Yeah, maybe we should call it quits." But Mark was already moving toward the trees. "Mark, stop!" I hissed, following him. "This is crazy." He didn't stop. He kept walking toward the voice, his expression blank, as if he was in a trance. I reached out, grabbing him and pulling him back just as a figure emerged from the fog. The same gaunt figure we'd seen earlier. It stood at the edge of the clearing, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its eyes hollow black pits. My blood turned to ice. "What is that?" Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. The figure took a step forward, its body moving in a jerky, unnatural way, like it didn't know how to walk properly. And then, with a sickening crack, it twisted its head to the side, staring at us with those empty, soulless eyes. Mark stumbled back, snapping out of whatever trance had held him. We need to go. Now." The four of us rushed to the RV, slamming the door shut behind us. Outside, the figure circled the clearing, watching us, waiting. The next few hours were a blur of panic. We tried to start the RV, but the engine sputtered and died. The flashlight batteries drained within minutes. Every time we looked outside, the figure was there, standing at the edge of the trees, just watching. "We're trapped," Eric muttered, pacing the small space of the RV. "What the hell is that thing?" "It's not real," I said, though even I wasn't sure anymore. "It can't be." But it was, and it wasn't going anywhere. Mark sat in the corner, his head in his hands. "It's the Wendigo," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What?" I asked, staring at him. The Wendigo, he repeated. It's an old Native American legend, a spirit of insatiable hunger. It drives people mad, makes them turn on each other. That's ridiculous, I said, but my voice shook. I've heard of it, Eric said, his face pale. It feeds on fear and hunger. A cold realization washed over me. The constant hunger we'd all been feeling, the strange cravings, the paranoia, everything had started the moment we'd arrived. It's trying to drive us mad, Mark said, his eyes wild. That's why it hasn't attacked. It wants us to destroy each other. By the time night fell, the Wendigo was closer, standing just outside the RV. Its gaunt, twisted face pressed against the window, its fingers tapping softly on the glass. Jessica couldn't take it anymore. I have to get out of here, she screamed, bolting for the door. Wait, I shouted, but it was too late. She was already outside, running into the woods. We rushed after her, but the fog swallowed her whole. I could hear her screaming, her voice echoing through the trees. And then, silence. We found her body a few minutes later. Her limbs were twisted, her face frozen in a mask of terror. The Wendigo stood over her, watching, its empty eyes locked onto us. We need to leave, Mark said, his voice shaking. Now. We stumbled back to the RV, but as we slammed the door shut, I saw the look in Mark's eyes. The hunger had taken hold of him. He was muttering to himself, his eyes darting toward me, then Eric. He's not right, Eric whispered. It's inside him. Mark lunged at me, his hands grasping at my throat. I'm sorry, he said, his voice cracking. I can't stop it. I struggled, pushing him off, and he collapsed to the floor, sobbing. Eric grabbed a metal pipe and stood over him, ready to strike if he tried again. We have to get out of here, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The Wendigo was still outside, waiting. As dawn approached, the fog began to lift. We packed what little we could carry and made a run for it, leaving the RV behind. The Wendigo didn't follow. It just watched, its hollow eyes locked onto us as we disappeared down the trail. Even now, I can still feel its gaze, like it's always there, just beyond the edge of my vision. Watching, waiting. I'll never go back to the wilderness again. Not after what I've seen. Not after what we've done. It had been 3 months since the divorce was finalized, and I was still trying to wrap my head around it. The life I had imagined, the woman I thought I would grow old with, it was all gone. That's why I decided to take the RV out to Mount Hood National Forest for a long weekend. I needed to get away from everything. No people, no reminders, just me and nature. My therapist said it would be good for me to clear my head, reconnect with something that didn't remind me of failure. Honestly, I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try something. If I stayed home, I would have just drowned myself in the silence of my empty apartment. This trip, I told myself, would be different. I could handle the quiet out here. I arrived in the late afternoon, pulling the RV into a spot near Timothy Lake. It was a beautiful area. Tall Douglas firs surrounded the lake like silent sentinels, the water reflecting the sky like a mirror. There were no other campers nearby, which was exactly what I wanted. Solitude. I parked, shut off the engine, and took a deep breath. The air was cool, crisp, with that faint scent of pine needles. Perfect. For a moment, I thought I could finally breathe again. After setting up a small campfire, I sat back in my foldable chair, staring at the fading light over the mountains. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Peace. That's what I needed. But as the sun dipped lower, the quiet became overwhelming. There was no wind now, no rustling, no animal sounds, just me, sitting in a bubble of silence. I checked my watch. It was just after 6 p.m. That's when I noticed it. It was too quiet. The forest around me, which should have been alive with the sounds of birds and insects, was dead silent. At first, I figured it was just a lull, but as the minutes dragged on, the silence pressed down on me like a weight. I could hear the blood pumping in my ears, the soft crunch of every movement I made in my chair. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. Maybe this was what true isolation felt like. No noise, no distractions, just me and my thoughts. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement between the trees. It was subtle, a shadow slipping between the trunks just far enough away that I couldn't get a good look. I froze, squinting into the woods. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that played tricks on my mind. I scanned the tree line, waiting for the shadow to return, but saw nothing. The trees stood still, their branches unmoving in the dead air. "Must be a deer," I muttered, forcing myself to relax. The wind picked up briefly, rustling the leaves. I sighed, relieved to hear some kind of noise again. I grabbed a few more logs and threw them onto the fire. The crackling wood was comforting, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. I told myself I was just on edge from being out here after so long, alone with too much time to think. After eating a quick meal, I decided to call it an early night. The silence was getting under my skin, so I climbed into the RV, locked the door behind me, and settled into the small bed in the back. My phone had no signal, of course, but I wasn't planning on talking to anyone anyway. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to let my mind go blank. But the silence didn't let me rest. The RV was soundproofed, but even then, I felt like something was missing. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just the absence of sound. I felt trapped inside my own head, every little shift of the mattress or rustle of my blanket amplified in the quiet. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. I wasn't sure why at first. There hadn't been any loud noises or nightmares, just silence. But something was wrong. My skin prickled with unease. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and glanced around the RV. The windows were fogged up and the air felt heavier somehow, oppressive. I heard something outside. No, that wasn't right. I heard nothing outside. I swung my legs out of bed and stood, listening closely. It was the strangest sensation, like my own breathing was distant, muffled, as though I wasn't entirely in my own body. I moved toward the window and wiped away some of the condensation with my sleeve, peering into the blackness beyond the RV. For a long time I saw nothing, just trees and shadows, and then movement. This time I was sure. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the moonlight. Tall, unnaturally still, like it was waiting for something. My heart leapt into my throat as I strained to see more clearly. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. I backed away from the window, heart pounding. My mind raced. Was it another camper? Some kind of ranger? No, there was no way anyone would be out here this late without a sound. I checked the door. It was still locked. Good. But I felt exposed, vulnerable, knowing that whatever was out there was watching me. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out the window, sweeping the beam across the clearing. The figure was gone. Just like that. Vanished, as if it had never been there. The next morning, the forest was still eerily quiet. No birds, no animals, just the constant, oppressive silence. I tried to shake off the unease from the night before, but it clung to me like a wet blanket. I told myself I was just paranoid, that the solitude was messing with my head. But something about the way the air felt today. Something was off. I decided to take a short hike to clear my mind, hoping that getting out of the RV would make me feel better. But as I ventured down the trail, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every few minutes I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, or something behind me, but the trail was empty. That's when I saw it again. A figure, this time in the distance, standing between the trees just off the trail. It was the same one from last night, tall, gaunt, and still. My heart hammered in my chest as I squinted, trying to make out more details. But before I could move, it slipped behind the trees and disappeared. I ran toward the spot where I'd seen it, my boots pounding against the damp earth. When I reached the trees, there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to show that anyone had been there at all. I stood there, catching my breath, feeling the silence pressing down on me like a vice. That's when I noticed something strange. The forest around me was completely still. Even my footsteps had stopped making noise. I stomped my boot on the ground, but I heard nothing. Not even the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. Panic surged through me. I clapped my hands together. Nothing. No sound. My breathing was shallow, frantic, but it was like I was listening to it from far away. The world had gone completely, impossibly silent. And then I saw them. Not just one figure, but several, moving between the trees, their bodies blending with the shadows. They were everywhere, circling me in complete silence. My heart raced, but I couldn't hear it. I couldn't hear anything. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. My legs felt heavy, every step muted, like I was running underwater. The forest shifted around me, the trail disappearing into the thick fog that had rolled in, disorienting me further. Somehow, I made it back to the RV. I slammed the door shut, locking it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but still no sound. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call for help, but it was useless. The screen flickered, the GPS spinning in circles. I was trapped. For the next few hours, I stayed inside the RV, pacing back and forth, trying to calm myself down. But the silence never lifted. I couldn't even hear my own thoughts anymore, just the crushing weight of nothingness. And then, as the light began to fade, I saw them again. The silent ones. They were standing in a circle around the RV, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. There were no features, no mouths, just smooth skin where their faces should have been. They stood perfectly still, watching me through the windows, their bodies unnervingly thin and elongated. I banged on the window, screaming, but of course, no sound came. They didn't flinch, didn't move. They just stared, waiting. Desperation clawed at me. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. Every time I tried, the engine sputtered and died, as if something was draining the life out of it. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, stepping outside. The silent ones didn't move, didn't react. But as I walked toward them, the air grew colder, the silence even more oppressive. My footsteps made no sound. My breathing was barely there. I felt a hand on my shoulder and spun around, expecting to see one of them behind me. But there was nothing. Just the fog swirling around me and the figures waiting in the distance. In that moment, I realized what they wanted. They weren't going to kill me. No, that would be too simple. They wanted me to join them, to become one of them. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a part of them, and it was seeping into me, stealing my voice, my thoughts, my very sense of self. And if I stayed here much longer, I knew I would lose everything. I don't remember how I made it out. The next thing I knew, I was driving, far away from the campsite, from the silent ones. The sound of the engine, the tires on the road, it was all faint, like I was still caught in their grip. But at least there was something, a reminder that I hadn't completely disappeared into that silence. It's been weeks since I got back, but I can still feel it. The quiet follows me, lingers in the corners of my apartment. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I can feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting, and I know that one day they'll come for me again. This time, I won't be able to run. The forest was supposed to be my escape. I drove the RV deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains, hoping the solitude would offer some kind of peace. I'd been out here a few times before, never this deep though, but it had always been calming. Nature had a way of making things quieter in my head. After I left the job, the silence became a companion, even though it haunted me with memories I wasn't ready to face. The accident that had ended my career as a paramedic replayed in my mind every night. Always the same horrific details, but with each viewing, a new way I could have saved the child. A different decision, a split second sooner, and maybe it didn't matter. I was here now, alone. The sound of the gravel crunching under my tires as I parked off an old dirt road was oddly satisfying. I turned off the engine, and for a moment, there was bliss. No noise except for the rustle of trees in the wind. This was what I needed. No sirens, no screaming, just the mountains. I grabbed my bag and climbed out, stretching my legs before heading over to the old fire lookout tower nearby. It was a relic, long abandoned and forgotten by most hikers. The wood was graying, peeling away from years of exposure, but it stood firm, a silent sentinel watching over the rolling hills. Something about the place had always intrigued me. It had a gravity, like it was holding secrets that only those who ventured close enough could learn. I planned to spend the weekend here, at least 3 days before I had to go back to reality. I didn't need much, just the stillness, the mountains, and a break from the memories. I set up camp near the RV, built a small fire, and tried to let go. But the quiet was different this time. The first night, it started with whispers. I was sitting by the fire, watching the flames flicker against the trees, when I thought I heard voices, not nearby, but carried on the wind. Faint, like a conversation just out of reach. I strained to listen, but they faded, lost in the rustle of the leaves. Probably just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. I hadn't slept well in weeks, and the quiet, while peaceful, was unnerving in its own way. After a while, I retreated to the RV, exhausted, but the voices lingered in the back of my mind, soft murmurs that tugged at my thoughts. As I lay down, I told myself it was nothing, just echoes of people who had camped here long before. The wind could carry sounds in strange ways out here, but the deeper I fell into sleep, the louder they grew, until I jerked awake, covered in sweat. There were no voices, just the oppressive weight of silence. I stared at the ceiling, the same question running through my mind. Was this peace or something else? The next morning, things started to get strange. I woke to find my watch blinking, frozen at 2:47 a.m. I tapped the screen a few times, but it refused to budge. Strange. When I checked my phone, it was dead, despite being fully charged the night before. I chalked it up to bad luck. But when I stepped out of the RV, the sun seemed higher in the sky than it should have been. It was late morning, but it felt like I had only just fallen asleep. I spent the day hiking, keeping my mind occupied. The trail was familiar. I'd hiked this ridge before, but something about it felt different. Landmarks I swore I'd seen on the way up seemed out of place, or worse, missing. And every time I thought I was making progress, I'd find myself right back where I started. The same twisted tree, the same rock formation, a loop. The disorientation didn't set in all at once. It was a slow, creeping unease that settled in my bones. The wind felt wrong too, as if it was carrying something I couldn't quite hear. Those whispers again, faint, distorted, carried on the breeze. This time, they were closer. By nightfall, the voices were louder. They weren't whispers anymore, but full conversations, disembodied words spoken in tones I couldn't place. It was like someone was just out of view, talking, laughing. At first, I stayed by the fire, trying to block it out. But the longer I sat there, the clearer the voices became. I couldn't make out what they were saying. but it was as if they were replaying over and over fragments of words lost on the wind. I stood up, scanning the tree line. Shadows flickered just beyond the light of the fire. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking in the stillness. No answer. The hairs on my neck stood up as I watched the shadows shift. A figure. It moved between the trees, far enough that I couldn't see clearly, but close enough to make my pulse quicken. My first thought was that it was another hiker, maybe someone lost. But when I took a step toward it, it vanished. Gone. As if it had never been there. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it into the woods, but the beam of light revealed nothing but trees. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks again, but my gut told me otherwise. There was something here, something I didn't understand. I retreated to the RV, locking the door behind me. But even inside, the silence was heavy. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The voices were still there, faint now, but constant. It felt like someone was standing just outside the RV, talking in circles, over and over. The next morning, I hiked to the old fire lookout. I don't know why. Something about the tower drew me in, like I needed to be there. It was old, dilapidated, and crumbling, but it held a strange power. When I reached the top, I could see for miles. The Blue Ridge Mountains stretching out in every direction, green and endless. I expected to feel some sense of peace, but instead, a deep dread settled in my chest. The lookout wasn't empty. It was filled with the remnants of people who had come here before me. Old camping gear, torn sleeping bags, cans of food long since expired. Graffiti scratched into the wooden beams, names etched into the walls, and something else. Carved into the center of the floor was a symbol, a crude spiral looping in on itself. I knelt down, running my fingers over the grooves. It looked old, weathered, like it had been there forever. The voices returned. This time they were louder, clearer. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the tower was empty. Just the wind whistling through the cracks in the wood. I ran my hands through my hair, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was very wrong here. The ridge, the lookout, it wasn't just an old campsite, it was a trap, a loop, and I was stuck in it. I tried to leave that afternoon, packed up the RV, started the engine, and drove down the winding road that had brought me here. But no matter how far I drove, the landscape didn't change. The trees, the rocks, it all blurred together, the same stretches of road repeating over and over. After what felt like hours, I found myself back at the campsite. The fire, now cold and dead, sat in the exact same spot. My heart sank. I tried again. This time, I took a different route. But once again, the RV looped back to the same spot. It was as if the mountain wouldn't let me leave. By nightfall, I knew the truth. The whispers weren't random. They weren't in my head. They were echoes. Echoes of the past. Of people who had been here before me. People who had tried to leave and failed. I sat in the RV, staring out the window at the darkening woods. The figures had returned. This time, there were more of them. They moved between the trees, watching me, waiting. One by one, they stepped into the clearing surrounding the RV. I could see them now, faded, distorted, like shadows of people long gone. Their faces were blank, their movements slow and deliberate. They said nothing, but I could hear them, their voices, the same words looping over and over. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. This was it. I was stuck, trapped in their endless loop, just like they were. The door creaked open. I don't remember what happened next, only that I woke up the next morning, sitting by the cold, dead fire. The RV door was wide open, the woods empty and still. But the whispers were gone. For now. I don't know how long I've been here. Days? Weeks? Time doesn't seem to work the same way anymore. Every time I think I'm getting closer to an answer, I find myself right back where I started. I'm not alone on this ridge. There are others. I can hear them sometimes. Their voices, echoing. I wasn't running away from my problems. I was just trying to get some space. That's what I told myself, at least. After the divorce, everything felt too close, too suffocating. The paperwork, the empty house, the awkward conversations with friends who didn't know how to bring it up. I needed to get away. And what better way than a solo trip into the wilderness? Dead Man's Creek. It sounded like the perfect place to clear my head. A name so bleak it made the reality of my situation seem trivial. Just me, my dog Max, and the open road. I'd driven the RV deep into Wyoming's Wind River Range, far away from the trails and tourists. That's what I wanted. Solitude. I found a spot, off the grid and well off the beaten path. The closest human was probably miles away, which suited me just fine. I set up camp near a bend in the creek, the water dark and slow, reflecting the towering pines above. The quiet was absolute, and I felt something like relief as I stood there, staring out at the wilderness, Max sniffing the ground beside me. "This is it, boy," I said, running my hand through his thick fur. "Just us. No distractions." Max wagged his tail, but his ears were perked, listening to the subtle sounds of the forest. The place was still. Too still. But that's what I wanted, wasn't it? Peace, quiet. No one to tell me what I'd done wrong or how I'd lost everything. Just the wide open woods and the whisper of the creek. The first night was fine. Quiet, uneventful. I cooked a simple meal over the campfire, Max stretched out at my feet. The stars were sharp and cold in the sky, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. But that peace didn't last. The second night, I noticed it. The silence. Not the calming, tranquil kind, but a deeper, unnatural stillness. There was no rustling of leaves, no chirping of crickets, no movement in the trees. Just the crackling of the fire and the low, constant murmur of the creek. Max, who usually dozed off by now, was alert, staring out into the dark with his ears flat against his head. "What is it, boy?" I asked, standing up and scanning the tree line. Nothing but shadows stretching between the pines. Still, Max didn't relax. His body was stiff, and every few seconds he'd let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. I grabbed the flashlight from the RV and shone it toward the woods, sweeping the beam across the darkness. Just trees. No glowing eyes, no movement. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. "Relax, Max. Probably just a deer or something." But Max didn't relax. He growled again, deeper this time, his fur bristling. The flashlight flickered. A cold wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint smell. Something rotten, like decayed meat left out in the sun. I wrinkled my nose, holding my breath for a moment. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that the wilderness was full of strange smells, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I tossed another log onto the fire, the flames flaring up with a loud crack. For a moment, the smell faded and the wind died down. Max settled a little but remained close to me, never taking his eyes off the woods. It was only later, when I was lying in bed in the RV, that I heard it. Soft at first, like a distant whisper. Crying. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound drifted through the trees, carried on the wind, faint but unmistakable. The sound of a woman crying. My first thought was that maybe someone was out there, lost in the woods, but no one else should be anywhere near this area. I hadn't seen a single car, a single hiker, nothing. "Help me!" The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the murmur of the creek, but it was there, clear as day. Max growled again, this time from his spot at the foot of the bed. He was staring at the door now, his body tense, ears flat. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and crept toward the door. my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to stay inside, to lock the door and ignore whatever was out there. But that voice, it was so desperate. I opened the door slowly, stepping out into the cool night air. The flashlight flickered to life, the beam cutting through the darkness. The crying had stopped. The forest was still again, but this time it wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud, too human for this unnatural quiet. "Is anyone there?" No answer, just the sound of the creek and the rustling of the trees. Max stayed at my side, his growl low and steady, and then I saw them. Footprints. Large, old-fashioned boot prints in the damp soil near the creek's edge. They weren't mine, and they certainly weren't recent. The edges of the prints were weathered, as if they'd been there for weeks, but that was impossible. I backed up, my heart pounding, pulling Max with me. I didn't sleep much that night, the echo of the crying woman replaying in my head. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was all in my mind. Too many nights alone in the wilderness, maybe a little too much whiskey by the fire. But something gnawed at me. Those boot prints, the voice, the smell of rot. Something was wrong here. I needed answers. I spent the afternoon hiking deeper into the woods, staying close to the creek. That's when I found it. An old campsite. Or what was left of one, at least. A broken-down wagon, rusted tools scattered in the dirt, and a few rotting planks of wood that might have once been part of a shelter. As I looked closer, I spotted something in the dirt. A small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. Carefully, I opened it, flipping through the delicate pages. The writing was faded, but I could make out enough. It belonged to a woman, a pioneer by the sound of it, who had traveled west with her family. They had camped near Deadman's Creek, just like I had. Her entries were brief at first, describing their journey and the hardships they faced. But the later entries grew darker, more frantic. "The cold is setting in. We lost Joseph last night. He wandered too far from the fire and we couldn't find him. I hear him sometimes calling out to me from the trees, but when I go to him, he's not there. My children, they're gone too. Taken by the woods, by the creek. I can't leave. I have to find them. I have to." The final entry trailed off, the ink smudged as if the writer had been interrupted. My stomach turned, and a chill crawled down my spine. I knew the legend of the crying woman, how she had lost her family in these woods and now wandered them, searching for her lost loved ones. I'd heard it mentioned in passing by locals when I'd asked for directions to the creek, but I'd brushed it off as folklore. But now I wasn't so sure. That night, the crying returned, but this time it was closer, louder. The weeping echoed through the trees, wrapping around the RV like a thick fog. "Help me, please," Max growled, his hackles raised as he paced near the door. I sat at the table, gripping the edge with white knuckles, my heart racing. The crying woman was out there, and she knew I was here. The RV began to shake, the windows rattling as if something or someone was moving around outside. I grabbed the flashlight and stood up, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't stay inside forever. I opened the door, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The crying stopped, but the air was thick with tension. The rotten smell was back, stronger this time, like it was coming from just a few feet away. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the trees, her figure barely visible in the flickering light of the campfire. Her skin was pale, her clothes torn and stained with dirt. Her hair hung in tangled strands over her face, and when she looked up at me, her eyes, dark, hollow, and wet with tears, seemed to stare right through me. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked and broken. "Help me find them." I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the ground as the woman took a step toward me. Her presence was cold, so cold that the air around her seemed to freeze. Max barked, snapping me out of my paralysis. I backed up, my heart hammering in my chest. "You're not real. You can't be real." But she was, and she wasn't leaving. "Please," she begged, reaching out a skeletal hand. "My children." I could feel the temperature drop even more as she drew closer. The journal. I thought of the journal I had found by the creek, the story of her lost family, her desperation. She was still searching for them even in death, and if I didn't do something, she would never stop. I grabbed the journal from the RV and ran toward the creek, the crying woman following me, her wails growing louder, more desperate. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the water's edge, holding the journal in my shaking hands. "Your family's gone," I said, my voice trembling. "They're gone. You need to rest." She stopped, standing at the edge of the creek, her dark eyes fixed on the journal. I placed it on the ground by the water, as if offering her some kind of closure. For a moment, the weeping faded, and the wind died down. The crying woman stared at the journal, then at me. Her eyes softened just for a second, and then she was gone. I left Dead Man's Creek the next morning, the journal still lying by the water where I'd placed it. As I drove away, the forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the oppressive weight lifting from the air. Max sat beside me, his head resting on my lap, finally calm. I'll never forget the sound of the weeping or the hollow eyes of the crying woman. She's still out there, somewhere, searching for something she'll never find. And I'll never return to those woods. Not again. I wasn't afraid of being alone. In fact, I thrived on it. After years of pushing myself, filming solo wilderness expeditions, and gaining thousands of subscribers, isolation felt like a familiar friend. Devil's Ridge, though. This place was something else. I had scouted it out for weeks, planning my trip down to the smallest detail. The ridge was perfect. Remote, rugged, untouched. Hardly any hikers came this far into the Montana wilderness, and the few who did warned of getting lost in the dense forests or disappearing into one of the old, crumbling mining tunnels. The place was steeped in eerie local lore, and I loved it. Stories of shadowy figures, night stalkers they called them, spirits of miners who perished in a cave-in over 100 years ago. They supposedly wandered these woods, haunting anyone foolish enough to linger too long. It was exactly the kind of place I could milk for my survival blog. Spooky, remote, and dripping with atmosphere. My audience would eat it up. I parked the RV in a small clearing nestled against a cliffside, setting up camp as the sun dipped below the horizon. The towering pines cast long shadows across the forest floor, and the sound of the wind through the trees was strangely muted. There was no bird song, no rustling of small animals, just the breeze and the soft creak of old branches swaying. Max, my drone, hovered above the trees, capturing the stunning panoramic views. I had just set it to autopilot to get some shots of the surrounding cliffs when the feed cut out, static flooding my screen. "What the hell?" I muttered, tapping the screen in frustration. I brought the drone back, its footage corrupted with strange distorted images, warped figures flickering in and out of focus, standing just at the edge of the tree line. I chalked it up to a malfunction. After all, I was miles from civilization, and the signal could have been weak. But still, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that the footage was wrong. Shrugging it off, I stored Max for the night and started a fire, settling in for what I hoped would be an uneventful evening. As I recorded my thoughts for the day, I decided to throw in a few words about the local legend, something to spice up the narrative for my viewers. "They call them the Night Stalkers," I said into the camera, my face illuminated by the glow of the flames. "Spirits of miners who died in these hills, lost to the darkness. But I'm not worried. Just a bunch of ghost stories, right?" I grinned, more to convince myself than anyone else. The first real sign of trouble came the second night. I was reviewing the footage I had shot earlier in the day when I heard a soft sound outside the RV. At first, I thought it was the wind, just the trees shifting. But then it came again, low and rhythmic, like tapping. Max growled low in his corner, his eyes fixed on the door. I froze, listening. The tapping grew louder, almost insistent, like someone, or something, was circling the RV, knocking softly against the metal. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on, and swung the beam toward the door. "All right, whoever's out there, you're not scaring me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. After a few long moments, I convinced myself it was just a branch or something scraping against the side of the RV. I'd been on enough solo trips to know how easy it was to get jumpy out here. But Max was still growling, his ears flat against his head. He wasn't convinced. Neither was I, if I'm honest. The next day, I decided to do a bit more exploring. The cliffs were full of old mining tunnels, most of them sealed up decades ago. I found one near the base of the ridge, its entrance boarded up with rotten planks. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried a few loose, slipping through the narrow gap. The tunnel was dark and smelled like damp earth. My flashlight flickered as I moved deeper inside, casting eerie shadows against the jagged walls. Strange symbols were etched into the rock, crudely drawn, unfamiliar shapes that seemed to spiral in on themselves. I felt a sudden chill, and a soft sound echoed through the tunnel, like footsteps on loose gravel. I froze, shining my light down the passage. Nothing. Still, something about the place felt wrong. I backed out quickly, breathing a sigh of relief as I stepped back into the daylight. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. I sat in the RV, clutching the flashlight in one hand, the other gripping my camera as I recorded the strange noises. The tapping moved around the RV, slow and methodical, almost as if it was circling me. I stood up, heart pounding, and yanked the door open, shining the light into the darkness. Nothing. I stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. The forest was still, but the air felt thick, heavy. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line, and that's when I saw them. Shadows, tall and thin, flitting between the trees. They moved like people, but their forms were indistinct, more like silhouettes than solid shapes. My chest tightened. I swung the flashlight toward the figures, but as soon as the beam touched them, they vanished, swallowed by the darkness. I stood there, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The wind had picked up, carrying faint whispers, almost like voices calling from the woods. I backed toward the RV, slamming the door shut behind me. The shadows grew bolder after that. No matter where I went, I could feel them watching me, their dark forms flickering just at the edge of my vision. My drone footage showed brief, eerie glimpses of them. Dark, human-like shapes moving through the trees, always just out of focus. I tried to leave the ridge, packed up my gear, loaded Max into the RV, and started the engine. But the moment I hit the ignition, the RV stalled. I tried again, and again. Nothing. It was as if the ridge itself didn't want me to leave. Panic set in. I wasn't one to lose my cool, but this was something I couldn't explain. I was trapped, and I wasn't alone. On the final night, everything came to a head. I was lying in bed, the RV windows covered, trying to block out the tapping that had returned. Max was huddled in the corner, trembling. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like something was trying to get in. I sat up, heart racing, and suddenly the RV shook violently, as if something had slammed into the side. I jumped to my feet, grabbing the flashlight, but the beam flickered and died. The whispers outside grew louder, more urgent, filling my head with a cacophony of unintelligible voices. I rushed to the door, flinging it open, only to be met with complete darkness. The fire outside had gone out. The shadows were everywhere now, circling the RV, their forms more defined than ever. Dark, human-like figures with no faces, no features, just endless blackness. They weren't just watching me anymore. They were coming for me. I ran, flashlight flickering back to life as I sprinted into the woods. The shadows followed, flitting between the trees, their whispers filling my ears, growing louder and louder. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Away from the tapping, the whispers, the shadows. But the forest twisted around me, disorienting me, and soon I was lost in a sea of towering pines and jagged rocks. And then I saw it, the entrance to the old mining tunnel, standing open like a gaping mouth. The shadows pressed in closer, their forms flickering at the edges of my vision, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had nowhere else to go. I stumbled toward the tunnel, the air inside cold and stale. The shadows followed me in, their whispers echoing off the walls. I don't know what I expected to find in there. An escape, maybe? A way out? But as I ventured deeper into the darkness, I realized the truth. There was no escaping them. The Night Stalkers weren't just spirits. They were part of this place, tied to the land, the tunnels, the shadows, and now, so was I. The last thing I remember before the darkness swallowed me whole was the sound of tapping, soft, rhythmic, and endless. Days later, when Ranger Hank found my RV, it was empty. My gear was scattered, my camera still rolling, but I was gone. The footage showed brief glimpses of my final moments. Me running into the forest, the shadows close behind, their forms flickering and twisting in the dark. The last frame caught my face, pale and terrified, standing at the entrance of the tunnel. A silhouette stood behind me, tall, thin, and featureless. The Night Stalkers had found me, and I was never leaving Devil's Ridge. The forest had never felt so thick, so claustrophobic. I had been on the road for weeks, traveling up and down the East Coast in my RV, looking for some peace. It was supposed to be a reset, a break from the grind after getting laid off from my tech job. I thought getting away from everything would give me a fresh perspective, but the road had only left me more exhausted. It was like I couldn't find what I was searching for, and I didn't even know what that was anymore. That's how I ended up in Ocala National Forest. It was early fall, and the place was practically deserted. The few tourists had already left, leaving the humid air and endless stretches of swamp and pine all to me. The ranger I passed when I pulled into the park didn't seem to think camping so close to the Devil's Eye Spring was a good idea. "There's no one else out there this time of year," he said, leaning into my open window with a cautious smile. "People get lost in that part of the forest, especially near the spring. Strange place. People say it's cursed." Cursed. Right. I didn't believe in any of that. I was here for quiet, not ghost stories. Still, his words stuck with me as I wound down the narrow trail in my RV, finally parking next to the spring. The water was still and black, perfectly round like the eye of some sleeping giant, with tall cypress trees surrounding it like ancient sentinels. The spot was isolated, just as I wanted. After setting up camp, I sat by the water and tried to take it all in. The only sound was the occasional splash of something in the water, fish maybe, or a frog. The heat was oppressive, the kind of sticky warmth that clings to you and makes every movement sluggish. I hadn't realized how worn down I was from weeks of driving, but the moment I sat down, the weight of exhaustion hit me like a brick. It was a heavy kind of tired, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you want to sleep for days. So that's what I did. I crawled into the RV, lay down on the thin mattress, and passed out. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. The RV was stifling, even with the windows cracked, and my head pounded like I'd been hit with a hammer. I sat up, rubbing my temples, trying to shake off the heaviness in my chest. That's when I noticed something strange. The forest outside was completely silent, not even the usual night sounds of crickets or frogs. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just the thick humidity dampening the sound. But then, in the stillness, I heard it. A soft whisper, faint and distant. It was impossible to make out the words, but I knew it was there. My pulse quickened. Who else would be out here in the middle of nowhere? I grabbed a flashlight, threw on my boots, and stepped outside. The air was still, and the beam of my light barely cut through the haze hanging over the spring. Nothing. I circled the RV once, shining the light over the trees, half expecting to catch someone watching me from the darkness. But there was no one. Only the trees, looming like shadowy figures in the mist. The whisper came again, this time closer. My skin prickled, and I pointed the flashlight in the direction of the sound. As the beam caught the nearest tree, I froze. There, carved into the bark, was an intricate spiral. It was faint, but I could see the markings etched deep into the wood, swirling inward like some ancient symbol. I hadn't noticed it when I arrived, but now it was unmistakable. "What the hell?" I muttered, running my fingers over the grooves. The texture was rough, jagged, fresh. Whoever had carved it had done it recently. But why? A chill crept down my spine, the kind that sticks with you even in the thick Florida heat. I backed away from the tree and went inside the RV, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a prank or some kind of tribal marking that had been there for years. But something still gnawed at the back of my mind. The whisper I'd heard wasn't a figment of my imagination. I was sure of it. When I stepped outside again, my eyes went straight to the tree. The spiral was still there, mocking me with its perfect precision. I walked a few paces around the campsite, scanning the other trees, and that's when I saw it. More spirals. Dozens of them carved into trees, rocks, even the dirt near the edge of the spring. It was like they had multiplied overnight. I knelt by one of the carvings in the ground, my fingers trembling as I traced the lines. They were everywhere. My pulse quickened as I stood up, stepping back. I hadn't imagined them. They were real, and there were too many to ignore. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the ranger had mentioned something about Native American tribes that once lived in the area. These carvings could be remnants of some ancient ritual or custom, but the more I looked at them, the more unsettled I became. I grabbed my phone, hoping to research the symbols, but when I turned it on, the screen flickered. Dead. I checked the time on my watch. It blinked nonsensically, stuck on 12 No matter how many times I reset it, it wouldn't budge. Time was frozen, just like the forest around me. The air felt heavier as the hours passed, like something was pressing down on me. The whisper returned, no longer distant, but close. Too close. It followed me wherever I went, slipping in and out of the thick, humid air, just out of reach. I could feel it in my bones. Something was watching me. That night, the dream started. I was lying in the RV, the air thick and suffocating, when I felt it. A presence standing over me, its breath hot against my skin. I tried to move, but I was paralyzed. My limbs refused to cooperate. I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my skull, and then came the whisper, low and guttural, words in a language I couldn't understand. But the intent was clear. I was marked. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding, the sheets soaked in sweat. The RV was stifling again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My eyes darted to the window, half expecting to see something staring back at me. The markings were spreading. They weren't just outside anymore. They were inside the RV, on the walls, on the floor, even on my skin. I tore off my shirt, running to the small mirror by the sink. There, on my chest, was a spiral, faint but unmistakable. My hands trembled as I traced the lines etched into my flesh, my mind racing. The curse, the ranger's warning, it was all real. The whispers were louder now, relentless. They filled my head, demanding my attention. I stumbled out of the RV, gasping for air, trying to escape the suffocating presence that had followed me. But no matter how far I ran, the whispers followed. I found myself standing at the edge of the Devil's Eye Spring, my chest heaving, the whispers swirling around me. The markings on the trees seemed to glow in the moonlight, pulling me toward the water. My reflection in the still surface was distorted, twisted, as if the thing inside me was staring back. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed a rock, sharp enough to cut, and slashed across the markings on my chest, trying to break the curse. Blood dripped into the water, staining the surface, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, as if the forest itself was angry. I fell to my knees, clutching my chest, feeling the burn of the cut mixing with the spiral. I could hear them now, the marked ones, the spirits of those who had come before me, trapped in the same cycle, marked by the same curse. They were waiting for me to join them. I don't remember how I got back to the RV. The next thing I knew, I was driving, the road stretching out in front of me, the forest blurring into the distance. The whispers were gone, but the sense of dread remained, a heavy weight in my chest. I thought I had escaped. I thought the ritual had worked. But when I glanced down at the dashboard, my blood ran cold. There, carved into the plastic, was a small, intricate spiral. I was still marked, and I knew the forest wasn't done with me yet. I came to the Pine Barrens for peace, solitude. I thought that getting away from everything would help, that losing myself in the wilderness would somehow fix what was broken inside of me. After my wife, Sarah, passed, nothing made sense anymore. My work as a photographer, pointless. The things I used to care about, gone. Grief had hollowed me out, leaving only a shell of the person I used to be. So, when the offer came to photograph the Barrens for a travel magazine, I didn't hesitate. I packed up my RV, grabbed my camera, and hit the road. The Pine Barrens had always intrigued me, with its dense forests and twisted folklore. But I wasn't here for ghost stories. I was here to work, to focus on something other than my own loss. That's what I told myself, at least. It was the second night when I first saw them. The lights. I had spent the day photographing the eerie, quiet beauty of the Barrens, the way the pines stretched up toward the sky like skeletal fingers, the sandy trails winding through dense underbrush. By the time I returned to my RV, the sky was already dark, stars barely visible through the thick canopy above. It was the kind of stillness I had been craving, the perfect backdrop for my long exposure night shots. I set up my camera, aiming toward the trees, capturing the stillness of the forest beneath the stars. As I clicked through the shots, I noticed something strange in the frames, small, glowing orbs in the distance. At first, I assumed they were fireflies, maybe even distant lanterns, but these lights were too bright, too concentrated. They hovered just beyond the tree line, flickering in and out of focus, as if dancing in the air. I looked up from the camera, squinting into the dark. Nothing. The lights were gone. I frowned, checking the screen again. There they were, clear as day, pale, round orbs glowing softly in the distance, just out of reach. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself it was a trick of the camera, some glitch or reflection I couldn't quite explain. The rational part of my mind dismissed it, but something else, a quiet, nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, told me something wasn't right. I didn't sleep well that night. Even inside the RV, with the doors locked and the curtains drawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that those lights were still out there, watching. The next morning, I pushed the strange encounter aside and decided to venture deeper into the forest. The barrens were an endless maze of pine trees and narrow, winding trails, and I wanted to capture the desolation, the beauty of the place. I slung my camera over my shoulder and set off, keeping an eye on my GPS to make sure I didn't get lost. The deeper I went, the more unsettling the forest became. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting like gnarled hands. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural. There were no birds, no rustling of leaves, just silence. I tried to ignore the growing sense of unease. I was here to work, not to get spooked by old legends, but as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My compass, which had been working fine all morning, suddenly started spinning erratically, the needle swinging wildly in every direction. My phone lost signal, the GPS cutting out entirely. I stopped, staring down at the malfunctioning devices in my hands. I was good with directions, had spent years hiking and camping in places far more remote than this, but now, standing in the heart of the barrens, I couldn't tell which way I'd come from, and the trees all looked the same. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint whisper. It was so soft, I wasn't sure I'd even heard it at first. Just the wind, I told myself, trying to shake off the creeping anxiety. I started to walk back toward the RV, retracing my steps as best I could. That's when I heard it again. Whispers, like distant voices carried on the breeze. Back at camp, I felt the full weight of isolation pressing down on me. The whispers from earlier hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd grown louder, clearer, as the day turned into night. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just on edge from being alone out here. But as darkness fell and the oppressive stillness of the forest closed in, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. I decided to review the photos I'd taken that day, hoping the distraction would calm my nerves. As I scrolled through the images, something caught my eye. The lights. There they were again, hovering just at the edge of the frame, bright and unmistakable. They flickered in the distance, glowing softly against the dark backdrop of the trees. I zoomed in, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the closer I looked, the more the lights seemed to blur, as if they were shifting, moving in some unnatural way. I glanced up from the screen, and my heart stopped. The lights weren't just in the photos, they were outside. I rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain, and there, just beyond the trees, I saw them. Pale, glowing orbs, floating silently in the darkness. They pulsed gently, like they were beckoning me, drawing me in. I felt a strange pull, an almost physical urge to step outside, to follow the lights into the woods. I told myself it was ridiculous, that I was being irrational. But the more I stared, the stronger the pull became. Before I knew it, I was grabbing my camera and heading for the door. The forest was darker than it should have been, the thick canopy blocking out any trace of moonlight. The lights moved ahead of me, hovering just out of reach, flickering in and out of sight as they led me deeper into the trees. I kept telling myself that I was only following them to figure out what they were, to get the perfect shot for my blog. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. There was something else drawing me forward, something I couldn't explain. The deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. The trees seemed to close in around me, twisting and warping, their shapes blurring in the darkness. My footsteps felt heavy, sluggish, like the ground was pulling at me, slowing me down. The lights, however, remained just out of reach, always moving a little farther ahead, urging me to follow. And then I heard it, Sarah's voice. Nate. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. Nate, come back to me. It was her. It had to be. The voice was so soft, so familiar, like the way she used to call me from the other room when she needed help with something. I stood there, frozen, staring at the lights as they pulsed gently, the sound of her voice swirling around me. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe she was out there, waiting for me. That somehow she wasn't gone, but something about the voice wasn't right. It was too distant, too hollow, like an echo from a place I couldn't reach. The lights flickered, growing brighter, and I felt the pull again, stronger this time, almost overwhelming. My mind screamed at me to move, to follow, to find her, but something deep in my gut told me not to. No, I whispered, backing away, shaking my head. This isn't real. I turned to run, but the forest had changed. The once familiar path was gone, replaced by an endless tangle of trees, all twisted and gnarled, like something out of a nightmare. The lights flared angrily, swirling around me now, their once soft glow becoming harsh and blinding. I stumbled, panic rising in my chest as the ground beneath me seemed to shift, pulling me down, the air growing thick and suffocating. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. Give in. Come with us. I ran blindly through the trees, the lights chasing me, flickering like angry fireflies. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping, creating a cacophony of sound that made it impossible to think. I wasn't sure how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and warp, just like the forest around me. But eventually, I spotted a familiar shape in the distance. The RV. I burst through the trees, collapsing against the side of the RV, gasping for breath. The lights hovered at the edge of the clearing, pulsing angrily, but they didn't follow. I scrambled inside, slamming the door behind me. The lights remained outside, flickering ominously, but they didn't come closer. It was as if something was keeping them at bay, something stronger than whatever force had been pulling me toward them. I slumped to the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion, my mind still reeling from the experience. The whispers had stopped, but the memory of them lingered, echoing in the back of my mind. I had nearly followed them, nearly given in. But whatever those lights were, they weren't Sarah. They never had been. As dawn broke, I didn't wait around to see if the lights would return. I packed up the RV and left the Pine Barrens behind, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lights were still out there, waiting for the next traveler to lose their way. The beckoning lights hadn't gotten me. Not this time. But I knew they wouldn't stop,